The horizon was still ink-dark when the engines began to hum. Aboard the carrier Akagi, young pilot Haruto Takahashi sat in the cockpit of his Zero, breathing in the briny Pacific air. The date was June 4th, 1942. Beneath the deck, final adjustments were being made. Mechanics worked quickly but carefully. On the carrier's bridge, officers peered into the early morning fog, unaware that 240 miles to the northeast, the Americans were already on the move. What the Japanese believed would be their triumphant blow, one that would eliminate the last major resistance in the Pacific, was about to become something else entirely. A disaster of unimaginable scale. 6 months earlier, Japan had stunned the world with its surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. But the victory, brilliant and swift, had come with a flaw. None of America's aircraft carriers had been in port. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of that first blow, knew the price of that oversight. Time was slipping through his fingers, and with it, the chance for Japan to consolidate its empire before America's industrial might came to bear. Yamamoto had lived in the United States. He'd walked the streets of Boston during his time at Harvard. He'd ridden trains past Pittsburgh's steel mills and studied shipbuilding in Newport News. More than any other Japanese admiral, he understood the scale of America's manufacturing power. That understanding haunted him. "Give me 6 months," he had warned Japan's leaders before the war. "After that, I have no confidence." Midway would be his gamble. If he could draw out the American fleet and destroy it, Japan might yet hold the Pacific. The target? A tiny atoll northwest of Hawaii, no bigger than 6 square miles. But Midway had strategic value far beyond its size. It was America's westernmost outpost, a refueling hub, and, more importantly, it offered the perfect bait. Yamamoto's plan, Operation MI, was simple in concept, deadly in ambition. But in execution, it was anything but simple. It was overly complex, spread across thousands of miles, and worst of all, founded on deeply flawed intelligence. In Tokyo, the corridors of power echoed with tension. Within the naval general staff, disagreement was rampant. Should Japan press its advantage south toward Australia, or turn east and settle the score with America? Yamamoto won the debate, but only through pressure and prestige. Some believed his plan to be reckless. He believed it was necessary. And with that, preparations began. But even the best-laid plans cannot survive flawed assumptions. In war games conducted just weeks before, American carriers arrived earlier than expected and inflicted major damage. Yet the results were dismissed. Officers overruled the simulation, refloating sunken Japanese ships as if willing reality to bend. At the center of it all was a fatal arrogance, what the Japanese would later call the victory disease. 6 months of unbroken success had clouded judgment. They assumed Yorktown was crippled after the Battle of Coral Sea. They assumed American pilots were unskilled. They assumed, most dangerously of all, that their codes were secure. They were not. Unknown to Yamamoto, the Americans had cracked Japan's naval code. At Pearl Harbor's station HYPO, Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team had been decrypting Japanese communications for months. They knew of Operation MI. They knew the target was Midway, and they were waiting. As dawn crept over the Pacific, the carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, turned into the wind. Below deck, bombs were loaded, fuel lines stretched across hangar bays, and brave men prepared for war. They didn't know it yet, but they were sailing into an ambush. The next 5 minutes of combat would change the course of the entire war. To be continued. It was spring in Tokyo when Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood in front of the tall windows of the Navy Ministry. He gazed out in silence past the shimmering city rooftops to a sky he feared would one day darken with American bombers. It had been 2 months since the Doolittle raid, a moment that had shaken Japan's military leadership to its core. B-25s launched from a U.S. carrier had bombed Tokyo, and while the physical damage had been minimal, the psychological blow was devastating. For Yamamoto, the implications were clear. If the Americans could strike the homeland, then nowhere was safe. Worse still, that raid had revealed the failure of Japan's earlier success at Pearl Harbor. The attack, although brilliantly executed, had left American carriers untouched. That fact haunted him. Carriers, not battleships, were the future of naval warfare, and now those very same carriers were emboldened and operating deep within the Pacific. In meeting rooms and strategy sessions, Yamamoto clashed with Japan's naval general staff. They favored consolidating control in the south, focusing on New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. But Yamamoto insisted otherwise. Time, he warned, was a weapon the Americans wielded better than any fleet. He had seen their factories, their endless trains and riverboats, their worker cities that never slept. He knew that once American industry truly turned to war, Japan would be buried under its weight. So he proposed Midway. It was a trap designed to draw out America's carriers. Take Midway, and they'd have no choice but to respond. And when they came, Japan would be ready with its full might. The decisive battle, Kantai-Kessen, the holy grail of Japanese naval strategy since the Russo-Japanese War, would finally be fought. Yamamoto was determined to deliver it. Yet the plan was far too complex. Over 200 ships would be involved, scattered across vast ocean expanses. There would be a northern feint to the Aleutians, a central invasion force, a carrier strike group, and Yamamoto's own battleship fleet far to the rear. Coordinating all these movements required perfect timing and perfect information. They had neither. Even among his closest aides, doubts simmered. Rear Admiral Matome Ugaki's war games revealed disturbing results. The Americans appeared sooner than expected and inflicted severe losses. But when Ugaki presented his findings, his superiors dismissed them. Some enemy hits were arbitrarily erased. Sunk Japanese ships were magically refloated. These were not rehearsals. They were fantasies. Lieutenant Commander Minoru Genda, one of the architects of the Pearl Harbor attack, voiced concern over the plan's complexity and the vulnerability of Japan's carrier force. But his warnings were ignored. Confidence, not caution, guided the War Council. In the meantime, Japan's intelligence was failing. They believed only 2 American carriers, Enterprise and Hornet, remained operational. The Yorktown, badly damaged at Coral Sea, was assumed to be out of action. What they didn't know was that American repair crews at Pearl Harbor, working around the clock, had patched her together in just 3 days. She would be ready and waiting. As final orders were issued, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo prepared to lead the carrier strike force. But Nagumo, though respected, was not a man of vision. A torpedo specialist by training, he lacked both faith and familiarity with carrier operations. At Pearl Harbor, it had been his caution that stopped a third wave from being launched. Now, tasked with an even more complex assault, he carried his doubts like shadows. His ships and crews had been operating for months without pause. Their planes were worn. Their pilots, though elite, were exhausted. Yet still, they sailed. On May 27th, Japan's great carrier force, the Kido Butai, departed from home waters. 4 carriers, over 240 aircraft. The same fleet that had devastated Pearl Harbor. The plan, lure, destroy, and dominate. But already, halfway across the Pacific, the Americans were preparing something very different, a trap of their own. To be continued. Far across the Pacific, deep within the concrete labyrinth of Pearl Harbor, a quiet revolution was unfolding. In a windowless room lined with decoding equipment and stacks of message transcripts, Commander Joseph Rochefort bent over a cluttered desk, chewing on an unlit cigar. He and his team at Station HYPO had been sifting through encrypted Japanese messages for months. In the early days of May, a group of strategists believed they had anticipated their counterparts' next move. The other side was planning a significant undertaking, but their coded messages only referenced the location as AF. The leaders suspected it was a particular island, but they needed confirmation, so the lead analyst devised a clever plan. He had the island station transmit a simple message claiming their fresh water system was having issues. Shortly after, an intercepted message from the other side noted that AF was experiencing water shortages. This was all the proof the commander needed. A calm and analytical leader, known for his resolve, he knew this was a pivotal moment. The opposing planners were becoming overly ambitious with their strategy, and if America could get its carriers into position in time, the entire course of the war might change. The Yorktown was patched together at Pearl Harbor in just 72 hours, a feat that stunned even the shipyard workers. The damage she had taken at Coral Sea was severe: cracked hull plates, ruptured decks, power failures. But the men worked around the clock, welding through the night, ignoring their own exhaustion. When she steamed out of port, battered but functional, she carried not just aircraft, but hope. Task Force 16, led by Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, aboard USS Enterprise, moved swiftly. Hornet followed close behind. They were soon joined by Task Force 17 under Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher on Yorktown. Together, these three carriers, America's entire remaining Pacific fleet, raced toward a point northeast of Midway. They called it Point Luck, an appropriate name given what was to come. Meanwhile, on Midway itself, the tiny coral atoll had become a fortress overnight. Crews erected sandbag walls, dug foxholes, and positioned anti-aircraft guns wherever they could. Reinforcements arrived daily: Marines, mechanics, and more aircraft. Radar had been installed, extending their ability to detect incoming planes. Though small in size, the island bristled with determination. As May turned to June, the Japanese moved into position. Rear Admiral Kakuji Kakuta's Northern Strike Group launched its attacks on the Aleutian Islands, hoping to draw the American fleet northward. But the bait failed. Thanks to code-breaking, Nimitz didn't bite. Nagumo's main force approached Midway under the cover of fog and silence. Strict radio discipline meant no one knew where the others were. The Japanese fleet, though massive, was effectively blind. On June the 3rd, American PBY Catalina flying boats spotted elements of the Japanese invasion group west of Midway. Alarms rang, orders snapped into place. American crews scrambled to meet the threat. On board the Akagi, Vice Admiral Nagumo remained unaware that he was no longer the hunter, but the hunted. Even as his pilots studied grainy recon photos of Midway's airfields and fuel tanks, their own fate was being plotted just over the horizon. That evening, as the sun sank below the Pacific, radar on Midway picked up blips. Dozens of them. The Japanese strike force was coming. Sirens wailed across the island. Pilots dashed to their planes. The night sky roared as American aircraft took off in waves, streaking into the dark. Unseen, unheard, beyond the curve of the world, 3 American carriers prepared their own ambush. To be continued. The morning of June 4, 1942, broke clear and quiet over the Pacific. Aboard the carrier Akagi, the men moved like clockwork. At precisely 4:30 a.m., the first wave of Japanese aircraft lifted off into the sky. 36 dive bombers, 36 torpedo bombers, and 36 fighters. Their target, Midway Atoll. Leading the strike was Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, a seasoned pilot whose reputation carried weight even among the elite. As the planes circled once over the fleet and then vanished southeast toward their objective, Vice Admiral Nagumo stood on the bridge, watching the horizon. Everything appeared to be going according to plan. Below deck, however, another set of aircraft sat armed and ready, held in reserve in case American ships were detected. In accordance with Japanese doctrine, Nagumo had chosen not to commit all of his planes in the initial strike. Half of them were held back, fitted with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs meant for naval targets. If enemy ships appeared, he could strike decisively. But if not, a second wave would be needed against Midway's stubborn defenses. The decision, cautious and logical, would soon prove disastrous. As the Japanese planes approached Midway, American radar stations picked them up at 5:53 a.m., 93 miles out. Sirens screamed across the tiny island. Pilots sprinted to their planes. In the control tower, orders came rapid fire. Launch everything. Bombers, fighters, reconnaissance craft. Whatever could fly was sent up. The first wave of Marine fighters, obsolescent Brewster Buffaloes, and a few newer Wildcats, rose to meet the incoming enemy. They never stood a chance. At 6:16 a.m., the Japanese fighters fell upon them. The Zeros, sleek, nimble, and flown by combat-hardened veterans, tore through the American formation. In minutes, more than half the Marine fighters were destroyed. Among the fallen was Major Floyd Parks, who had radioed his final transmission just moments before. Hawks at Angels 14, supported by fighters. His words vanished into static. Despite the losses, the American defenders had bought precious time. When Tomonaga's bombers reached Midway at 6:30, they found the island not asleep but wide awake. Anti-aircraft fire lit up the sky. Despite this resistance, the Japanese bombers struck with precision, cratering the runways, igniting fuel tanks, and damaging buildings. But as Tomonaga circled to assess the damage, he saw something troubling: American bombers still lifting off. The runway, though pocked and smoking, remained usable. At 7 o'clock a.m., Tomonaga radioed back. Midway was not neutralized. A second strike would be required. Nagumo received the message just as American torpedo bombers and heavy bombers launched from Midway began attacking his fleet. They came in piecemeal: TBF Avengers, B-26 Marauders, dive bombers, all of them inexperienced and ill-coordinated. But they kept coming. Zeros shot them down in droves. One B-26, riddled with bullets, made a desperate run at Akagi, its gunners killing 2 sailors before the aircraft soared past the bridge and disappeared. Nagumo, shaken, reportedly ducked for cover as it passed. The Japanese defense held, but chaos was mounting. Down in the hangars, maintenance crews had begun switching out torpedoes for land attack bombs to prepare for a second Midway strike. Now, with these desperate American attacks crashing around them, the order came to reverse course again, switch back to torpedoes. Time was vanishing. And then, at 7:28 a.m., a scout plane finally reported something that would change everything. Sighted what appears to be 10 enemy ships. Nagumo's mind raced. Were these cruisers? Battleships? Carriers? He needed clarity. The scout plane's delayed launch, 30 minutes late due to mechanical problems, meant this information was arriving too late to act cleanly. For the next agonizing minutes, he waited for confirmation. What he didn't know was that just beyond the horizon, American dive bombers were already in the air and heading his way. To be continued. By 8:20 a.m., the tension on the bridge of Akagi had become suffocating. Vice Admiral Nagumo, flanked by his staff, stood silent as a delayed radio message finally crackled through. The earlier sighting of enemy ships, now confirmed to include at least one American aircraft carrier. The blood drained from Nagumo's face. In a moment, the entire complexion of the battle shifted. What had begun as a textbook assault on a lightly defended island was now spiraling into a carrier duel, one the Japanese were unprepared for. His reserve planes, scattered across 4 carriers, were in chaos. Some were fully armed with torpedoes. Others were mid-reload for land attacks. Fuel lines lay tangled across hangar decks. Bombs and torpedoes were stacked dangerously close together. And above it all, time ticked mercilessly. Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, commander aboard the Hiryu and known for his aggressiveness, sent a stark recommendation: launch attack force immediately. It was a risky move, proposing a strike with whatever was ready, regardless of coordination or fighter cover. Commander Minoru Genda, the operation's tactical mastermind still recovering from surgery, agreed. Launch now, he urged. Speed is everything. But Nagumo hesitated. Doctrine demanded a full organized strike with proper fighter escorts. To launch in haste might result in failure and further chaos. Captain Ryunosuke Kusaka, Nagumo's chief of staff, pressed for caution. Better to recover Tomonaga's strike force first, then rearm and launch with overwhelming power, and so Nagumo made his fateful decision. He ordered recovery of the returning planes from Midway before committing to a counterstrike. It seemed prudent, it seemed reasonable, but it was a decision made without understanding the true proximity of the American carriers, or the danger barreling toward him from the skies. At 8:37, Tomonaga's strike force began to land. Pilots were exhausted, fuel nearly gone, but they had made it back. On the hangar decks, chaos intensified. Aircraft were lowered, rearmed, refueled, safety protocols were discarded in the scramble. Torpedoes were left exposed. Gasoline fumes filled the air. The Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, had become floating powder kegs. All the while, American planes were closing in. From the decks of Hornet, Enterprise, and Yorktown, 3 waves of torpedo bombers had launched earlier that morning. They were flying straight into danger, slow, under-defended, and outdated. But they flew anyway, hugging the waves, determined to draw Japanese fighters downward. At 9:20 a.m., the first group arrived, 15 TBD Devastators from Hornet's Torpedo Squadron 8, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron. They had no fighter escort. They faced dozens of elite Japanese Zeros. They were slaughtered. One by one, the Devastators were picked apart. Not a single torpedo found its mark. All 15 were destroyed. Of the 30 crewmen, only one survived, Ensign George Gay, who would float alone in the Pacific, watching the battle unfold. At 9:54, Enterprise's torpedo squadron arrived. Then Yorktown's followed. The story repeated. Bravery unmatched, losses devastating. Of 41 torpedo bombers, only 6 would return. No hits were scored, but their sacrifice was not in vain. The Zeros, busy tearing apart the low-flying attackers, were drawn to sea level. They had no time to climb back to altitude, and above them, unseen in the piercing blue sky, came the real threat. 37 dauntless dive bombers. They had found the fleet, to be continued. At 10:20 a.m., the lookout atop Akagi's bridge saw them first. Tiny dark specks in the brilliant blue sky, growing larger with every heartbeat. His cry of "Helldivers" echoed across the carrier, but it was already too late. With every Zero drawn down to sea level, the skies above the Japanese carriers were wide open. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading 33 dauntless dive bombers from the USS Enterprise, had gambled everything. His planes were low on fuel, his men exhausted. He had pushed beyond his calculated interception point, following a lone Japanese destroyer, Arashi, that was racing to rejoin the fleet after depth-charging an American submarine. That single choice led McCluskey straight to Nagumo's carriers. From another direction came Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie's 17 Dauntlesses from the USS Yorktown. By sheer luck or fate, both groups arrived over the Japanese carriers at the same moment. Below them, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were lined up perfectly, their decks cluttered with fueled and armed aircraft, bombs and torpedoes stacked like dominoes, the perfect targets. At 10:22 a.m., McCluskey rolled into his dive on Kaga. His wingmen followed. The screaming plunge of the Dauntlesses was like a hawk stooping on prey. Bombs whistled down through the morning air. The first hit landed just forward of Kaga's island, ripping open the flight deck. The second plunged into the hangar, where rows of armed aircraft erupted in flames. The third set off a chain of explosions. Within minutes, Kaga became a firestorm, ammunition cooking off and aviation fuel feeding a wall of flame that engulfed the ship. Lieutenant Richard Best of Enterprise led his section against Akagi. Only one bomb from his group struck home, but it was enough. It pierced the flight deck and exploded amid a cluster of planes being refueled and rearmed. The resulting inferno swept through the carrier's heart. Torpedoes detonated, bombs ignited. In less than 5 minutes, Akagi, Nagumo's flagship and pride of the fleet, was mortally wounded. At the same time, Max Leslie's Yorktown bombers descended on Soryu. 3 direct hits ripped open her hangars, setting off more secondary explosions. Her captain, Ryusaku Yamamoto, refused to abandon ship. Witnesses would later recall seeing him on the bridge, sword in hand, singing the national anthem as flames closed in around him. The transformation was instantaneous. Moments before, Japan had possessed the most powerful carrier strike force in the world. Now, 3 of its 4 carriers were burning, decks littered with twisted wreckage, sailors and pilots scrambling to escape the fire. The ocean itself seemed to boil with black smoke rising into the sky. Only the Hiryu, positioned several miles away and partially hidden by clouds, escaped the carnage. On her bridge, Rear Admiral Yamaguchi watched the disaster unfold with a mixture of disbelief and grim determination. Without hesitation, he began preparing a counterstrike. On Akagi, Nagumo stood frozen, the bridge around him a chaos of shouted orders and smoke. Below deck, men tried to fight fires already beyond control. Fuel hoses turned to molten snakes, bombs cooked off with thunderclaps that shook the ship from bow to stern. In minutes, his flagship, the nerve center of Japan's great gamble, was doomed. And above it all, the Dauntlesses climbed away, fuel gauges nearly empty, their pilots scarcely believing what they had done. In 5 minutes, the Battle of Midway had turned upside down. To be continued. As smoke from the stricken carriers darkened the morning sky, A single ship remained capable of striking back. Hiryu. Aboard her, Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi didn't flinch. His command was clear: launch everything. At 10:58 a.m., just minutes after the other carriers had been engulfed in fire, Hiryu sent 18 dive bombers and 6 fighter escorts roaring into the sky. Leading them was Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi, a veteran pilot with a sharp mind and steady hand. Their target, the American carrier force that had just shattered the heart of the Japanese fleet. Back on the USS Yorktown, the mood had shifted from triumph to tension. Lookouts scanned the skies. The ship's radar picked up incoming aircraft just after noon. Wildcat fighters launched into the air and gun crews rushed to their stations. The battle wasn't over. It was coming back with a vengeance. At 12:10 p.m., Kobayashi's dive bombers plunged toward Yorktown. Despite a fierce defense from American fighters and flak, several made it through. 3 500-pound bombs struck the carrier. One tore through the flight deck and exploded below. Another ripped into the forward elevator. The third detonated near the island superstructure, sending steel and smoke into the air. Fires raged. The ship shuddered. Men were thrown from their feet. For a time, it seemed the Yorktown might be lost. But the American crew responded with stunning efficiency. Damage control teams, trained and disciplined, moved swiftly. Hoses snaked through the corridors. Pumps roared to life. Bulkheads were sealed. And slowly, impossibly, the ship was stabilized. Within 2 hours, Yorktown was moving again at 20 knots. Admiral Yamaguchi, learning that his first strike had not crippled the American carrier, made his next decision without hesitation. He ordered a second wave into the air. This time, only 10 torpedo bombers and 6 fighter escorts could be mustered. Fuel was running low, planes were damaged, pilots exhausted, but there was no room for delay. Leading this strike was Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, the same man who had led the morning attack on Midway. But now his aircraft had only one functional fuel tank. Maintenance crews had offered to switch planes. He refused. Every machine was needed. Tomonaga knew he would not have enough fuel to return. At 2:30 p.m., Tomonaga's squadron found Yorktown again. The carrier, barely patched together, was still sailing and still vulnerable. American fighters scrambled to intercept. A fierce dogfight broke out above the blue Pacific. Zeros tangled with Wildcats, cannons flared, planes spiraled toward the sea. Tomonaga pressed on. His bomber took hits, flames licking at the fuselage. Still, he held formation, zeroed in on the listing Yorktown, and released his torpedo just moments before his plane crashed into the waves. 2 torpedoes struck home, blasting open the carrier's port side. Water poured in. The ship listed sharply. This time, the damage was too severe. Orders were given to abandon ship. As lifeboats lowered and sailors plunged into the sea, many looked back at Yorktown with disbelief. She had survived one hammer blow and kept fighting. Now, despite their efforts, she was sinking. But unknown to them, Yorktown's ordeal was not yet over. And for Admiral Yamaguchi, Hiryu's final strike had found its mark, but he knew what would follow. The Americans were not done, to be continued. The sun was beginning its slow descent when the final act of the day took shape. At 5:00 p.m., after hours of search and silence, 24 dive bombers from the USS Enterprise found their last target, Hiryu. The last operational Japanese carrier was steaming hard, trying to maneuver away from the devastation that had consumed her sisters. Clouds had sheltered her throughout the day, a ghost on the sea, but her luck had finally run out. The American planes, guided by smoke trails and fading radio signals, descended like judgment. The first bombs struck just after 5:03 p.m. One exploded near the forward elevator, hurling metal and flames high into the air. Another tore through the hangar deck, where fully armed planes were being prepped for yet another strike. Fires erupted instantly. Aviation fuel ignited. In minutes, Hiryu became a floating inferno. On the bridge, Rear Admiral Yamaguchi understood what had happened. The decisive blow he had feared had come at last. He called his men together on the tilting flight deck, the orange light of the fire casting flickering shadows across their soot-smeared faces. His message was simple. They had done their duty, and now others must carry the torch. He refused evacuation. Captain Tomeo Kaku, Hiryu's commanding officer, stood beside Yamaguchi. Both men remained at their posts as the flames closed in. Witnesses later recalled their silhouettes still upright on the burning bridge. Refusing to abandon ship, it was a final symbolic stand, a warrior's farewell. That night, 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, had already slipped beneath the waves. Hiryu would burn through the dark hours, finally scuttled early the next morning. In less than a day, Japan's premier strike force had been decimated. Over 3,000 sailors and airmen were gone. But the cost was not one-sided. Yorktown, though still afloat, was gravely wounded. Tugboats had begun towing her towards safety, a slow and perilous journey. Crews remained aboard, fighting fires, patching leaks, holding on to hope. She had survived 2 separate strikes. Her luck, however, was also nearing its end. On June 6th, a Japanese submarine, I-168, found the wounded carrier being towed. Slipping past the destroyer screen, the submarine fired a spread of torpedoes. 2 struck Yorktown. 1 hit the nearby destroyer Haman, which exploded and sank in 4 minutes, killing 80 men. Yorktown began to roll. She didn't sink immediately. She clung to life for nearly a full day before finally slipping beneath the Pacific at 7:01 a.m. on June 7th. The depth swallowed her whole. She came to rest nearly 17,000 feet down, joining the carriers she had helped destroy. In the aftermath, silence blanketed the ocean. Flames flickered across oil-slicked waters. Lifeboats drifted. Debris bobbed like driftwood, shattered wings, broken radios, scorched helmets. The ocean had consumed them all. On the decks of American ships, sailors stood in stunned reflection. The battle was won, but the cost was visible in every empty seat at mess, every unused bunk. The Japanese had been dealt a devastating blow. But this was no cause for celebration. It was a moment to exhale and to understand. The tide of the Pacific War had turned. To be continued. As the waves rolled over the resting place of 4 sunken Japanese carriers, the scale of the catastrophe began to settle over the surviving sailors. On the evening of June 5th, aboard the mighty battleship Yamato, still 600 miles from the fight, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood on the deck, silent. He had gambled everything. Midway was supposed to be the crowning achievement of his strategy, a final decisive blow that would cripple American naval power. Instead, it had become a nightmare. With a heavy heart, he issued the only order left: cease the operation, withdraw. The humiliation was too great to be made public. Survivors from the carriers were secretly distributed among destroyers and transports. They were denied communication, kept away from the rest of the fleet, and forbidden to speak of what they had seen. Some were treated not as heroes who had faced a disaster, but as men who had brought shame to the empire. In Japan, official reports announced a great victory. Radio broadcasts trumpeted the sinking of 2 American carriers and the destruction of enemy air forces. It was a lie, carefully crafted to maintain public morale. Mothers of the fallen received condolences wrapped in propaganda. Sons who had burned in hangars or drowned in oily seas were said to have died in triumph. The truth remained buried beneath the waves. Akagi had taken 267 men with her. Kaga 811, Soryu lost 711, Hiryu 392. Another 700 were lost when 2 heavy cruisers, Mikuma and Mogami, collided while retreating and were then caught by American aircraft. The dead numbered in the thousands, but it wasn't just numbers that sank. It was Japan's elite. Most of the Japanese aviators survived, rescued at sea, but the real loss came in the form of mechanics, armorers, and deck crews. These were men whose experience couldn't be replaced with a training manual. They had trained alongside their planes, understood every rivet and wire. Their deaths tore an irreplaceable hole in Japan's war machine. Meanwhile, American losses were significant but recoverable. The USS Yorktown, though gone, would soon be replaced. Her crew's bravery had bought time, inflicted damage, and turned the tide. And crucially, the American dive bomber squadrons, the unlikely heroes of the battle, had proven that with the right moment, even a lightly armed aircraft could destroy giants. Back in Japan, the High Command scrambled to preserve appearances. The names of the destroyed carriers remained on official rosters. No flag officers were reprimanded. No court-martials convened. Admitting defeat was unthinkable. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo wasn't even told the full truth for weeks. Among those who had survived, bitterness began to take root. Many knew that pride, arrogance, and flawed planning had led them to ruin. One officer later wrote in his journal, "We deceived the nation, and we will pay for it in blood." Admiral Yamamoto, who had long understood the dangers of underestimating America, withdrew into himself. He spent days in his cabin, pacing alone, refusing to speak. To one aide, he whispered, "I have lost the means to win this war." And he was right. Midway had not just broken ships, it had broken illusions. To be continued. In the quiet days following the battle, the Imperial Japanese Navy fell into a stunned silence. Though the official story was one of triumph, the mood within the fleet was anything but celebratory. The men knew. The survivors had seen the truth in flames and twisted steel, and the officers who had ordered it all were beginning to feel the weight of what had been lost. Admiral Yamamoto, once the architect of Japan's bold strategy, knew better than anyone that Midway marked a turning point. His prediction, spoken years earlier with reluctant certainty, had come true. Japan had 6 months to run wild. Now the clock had stopped. There would be no second chance. In the weeks that followed, American reconnaissance confirmed what intelligence had already suggested. 4 Japanese carriers gone, with another crippled cruiser sunk. The United States had struck a blow far greater than Pearl Harbor. At Pearl, America had lost ships. At Midway, Japan had lost its future. The Imperial Navy had no rapid replacement plan. Carrier construction was slow, pilot training even slower. While America could produce new aircraft and ships at industrial speeds, Japan's wartime production was rigid, decentralized, and lacking the manpower to sustain its momentum. The men who had died at Midway weren't just sailors, they were specialists, veterans, the irreplaceable backbone of naval aviation. Worse yet, the aura of invincibility surrounding Japan's military had shattered. For years, they had won every battle. From Shanghai to Singapore, their forces had advanced, seemingly unstoppable. But Midway revealed their vulnerabilities, their overconfidence, their assumptions. Within the Navy, blame circulated quietly. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, whose indecision and adherence to outdated doctrine had paralyzed the fleet at a critical moment, was removed from carrier command. Though no public disgrace followed, he would never again lead a carrier task force. In 1944, as Japan's position collapsed, Nagumo would take his own life on the island of Saipan. Admiral Ugaki, Yamamoto's chief of staff, wrote in his diary with brutal honesty, "We can build ships in 2 years. We cannot build men like those we lost in 20. The Japanese army, kept largely in the dark about the full extent of the disaster, continued planning offensives as if nothing had changed. But inside the naval staff, the mood had shifted. Doubt crept in. The realization was unavoidable. Japan was now on the defensive. In America, the reaction was muted. There was no parade, no grand announcement, only quiet, determined recognition that the tide had turned. President Roosevelt knew that a long road remained, but Midway had delivered a critical truth to both sides. Japan could be beaten. The battle's lessons were already shaping new strategies. The U.S. Navy began refining its carrier tactics, improving coordination between air wings and surface ships. More importantly, young aviators, fresh from training programs that were expanding rapidly, saw Midway as proof that they could win and survive. But even amid hope, the human cost was undeniable. Hundreds of American airmen had died, many in outdated planes with little chance of survival. Their sacrifice had paved the way for victory. And on the Japanese side, thousands had perished, some screaming for their mothers in the smoke-choked corridors of burning ships. Beneath the waves, the wrecks of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu lay silent, their decks crumpled, their aircraft entombed. War graves, each one. And above them, the Pacific rolled on, carrying forward the war that Midway had forever changed. To be continued. By midsummer 1942, the implications of Midway rippled far beyond the battle itself. In Tokyo, strategy sessions turned grim. The once confident momentum of Japanese expansion had hit a wall. Plans to invade Fiji, Samoa, and even Hawaii were quietly shelved. The so-called Operation FS, to sever supply lines between America and Australia, was cancelled. The illusion of control had been shattered. Inside Japan's naval general staff, tempers flared behind closed doors. The architects of Midway's disaster were protected publicly, but in private, officers whispered of miscalculations, hubris, and failed leadership. Yamamoto remained untouched, his legendary status shielding him from political fallout, but even he could not reverse what had happened. Letters from the front began to paint a darker picture. Survivors wrote home in vague language, restricted by censorship and the burden of secrecy. Families of the dead received tidy notifications praising their son's sacrifice, declaring victory in glowing terms. But behind the words was a creeping despair. In American war rooms, the mood was cautiously optimistic. Midway wasn't the end, it was the beginning of something far more difficult. For all its success, the United States had only blunted Japan's sword. The empire still stretched across thousands of miles and dozens of islands. But the myth of Japanese invincibility had been destroyed. Across the Pacific, in the Solomon Islands, US Marines began preparing for the next major offensive. An operation that would launch in August and turn the war into a grinding, island-by-island campaign. That operation was called Guadalcanal. But Midway's legacy was more than tactical. It changed how war was understood. No longer did battleships dominate the seas. Aircraft carriers, with their range and versatility, had become the new kings of naval warfare. The battle had proven that air superiority, coordination, and intelligence were now the determining factors of victory. The American codebreakers, those unsung heroes in the shadows of Pearl Harbor, had struck a blow as surely as any dive bomber. Commander Joseph Rochefort's work at Station High-IPO had made Midway possible, and though he received little credit at the time, his team's efforts were quietly acknowledged by Admiral Nimitz himself. Meanwhile, Japanese code security remained dangerously flawed. Despite hints that their communications were being compromised, Japanese officers clung to the belief that their systems were unbreakable. This failure to adapt would haunt them in every battle to come. As for Yamamoto, he carried Midway's weight on his shoulders. In private letters to trusted colleagues, he confessed that the defeat was not due to luck, but to a fatal underestimation of the enemy. "We thought them soft," he wrote, "but they were merely waiting." He foresaw the long grind ahead and understood the stakes. In one particularly somber reflection, he wrote, "We have awakened a giant and filled him with a terrible resolve." Midway had not ended the war. It had simply clarified its future. On both sides of the Pacific, families began to understand that what lay ahead was not glory, but sacrifice, to be continued. The deeper truths about Midway would take years to fully surface. In Japan, the official narrative remained firm for the duration of the war, victory, or at worst, honorable loss. But behind the tightly sealed lips of naval officers and the censored headlines, the truth lived in memory, in whispers, and in the eyes of the survivors who carried its burden. Among them was Petty Officer Hiroshi Tanaka, a flight deck mechanic aboard Soryu. In a post-war interview decades later, his voice shook as he recalled the morning the bombs hit. "We were rearming," he said. "Fuel hoses snaked across the deck, bombs stacked near the elevators. Then came the scream, from the sky, and the world became fire." He had crawled through thick black smoke, hearing the screams of men he'd worked beside for years. Some were buried beneath twisted steel. Others were on fire, running blindly into walls, calling out for their mothers. Tanaka escaped. Most didn't. These memories, raw, vivid, and full of unhealed wounds, would haunt many for the rest of their lives. Survivors were often treated not as heroes, but as shadows, hidden from public view, moved from ship to ship. Some never returned home. Others died later in the war, their stories never told. And then there was Mitsuo Fuchida, the lead pilot at Pearl Harbor, who had been too sick to fly at Midway. From his hospital bed aboard Akagi, he watched preparations unfold with unease. Though his post-war writings would be marred by inconsistencies and embellishments, some of his reflections carry a haunting tone. "I felt it, a heaviness in the air, as if something unseen had already decided our fate." Fuchida would later become a Christian evangelist in America, preaching reconciliation and peace. His transformation was remarkable, though many questioned the full truth of his wartime accounts. Still, he, like many others, came to see Midway not just as a military event, but a moment of reckoning. In the decades that followed, Japanese historians slowly began piecing together what had really happened. The records of code-breaking, the delays, the miscommunications, the flawed tactics, the overconfidence. Midway, they concluded, was less a battle lost to the enemy and more a tragedy caused from within. Admiral Yamamoto's death, less than a year later in April 1943, only deepened the mythos. His plane was shot down by American fighters, guided by intercepted Japanese communications, another triumph of code-breaking. Found still strapped into his seat in the jungle of Bougainville, his sword by his side, Yamamoto died with the full knowledge of what Midway had cost. In a letter found among his belongings, he had written, "At Midway, we faced not just the enemy's planes, but the consequences of our pride. We believed spirit alone could carry us. But wars are not won by courage without clarity." Midway became more than a battle. It was a mirror held to Japan's war machine, a reflection of its brilliance and its blindness. And the waves above those sunken decks would forever echo with lessons too costly to forget. To be continued. In the years following the war, the wrecks of Midway remained lost to time. The ocean held its secrets tightly. But for historians and veterans alike, the search never stopped. They needed to know, where had those ships gone? What stories remained below? It wasn't until the 21st century that the answers began to emerge. In 2019, an expedition led by the research vessel Petrel, funded by the late Paul Allen, co-founder of Microsoft, located the Japanese aircraft carrier Kaga. Resting at the bottom of the Pacific, nearly 18,000 feet below the surface, she lay in eerie silence. Her massive hull was ruptured, her flight deck twisted, but she was unmistakable. A relic of a vanished age. Soon after, Akagi was found. Her hull still bore the scars of fire and violence. Researchers marveled at the preservation, the way time had settled like dust over the twisted beams and rusting guns. It was a moment of awe and quiet reverence. For the Japanese researchers on the team, it was personal. Some had lost family in the battle. Seeing the ships again, even through grainy video feeds from remote submersibles, stirred emotions long buried. One whispered, "They've waited for us." But these discoveries were more than historical footnotes. They were windows into a moment when the world turned. Every piece of wreckage told a story: a torn hatch, a collapsed hangar, the ghostly outlines of planes still resting in place. Each detail testified to the speed, the violence, and the human cost of that fateful day. Back in the United States, survivors of the battle, fewer each year, watched the news with quiet reflection. Men who had once clung to life on burning decks or floated for hours in oil-slicked water now saw the graves of their enemies brought into the light. For many, it wasn't about victory anymore. It was about memory. At one reunion, a Yorktown veteran stood before a group of high school students and said, "We didn't hate those boys we fought. They were just like us, scared, brave, trying to make it home." That humanity, once obscured by war and propaganda, had slowly emerged. Midway had once been called a miracle. But miracles don't come without cost. And as time passed, the line between victor and vanquished grew thinner, replaced by shared mourning. In Japan, the battle became a subject of sober study. No longer wrapped in glory or shame, it was dissected for lessons about planning, communication, humility. War colleges taught it not as a tale of defeat, but of misjudgment and its consequences. The sea had taken much, but it had also preserved the truth, and in rust and silence it whispered the names of the lost. To be continued. As decades passed, the Pacific Ocean continued its quiet vigil over the resting places of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. What had once been the pride of Japan's naval power now lay silent, deep beneath the waves, untouched, unseen, and mostly forgotten by all but a few. But for those who remembered Midway, not just historians and veterans, but families, descendants, and students of history, it remained a point of profound reflection. Not simply for the tactics or the hardware, but for what it revealed about leadership, risk, and the limits of human ambition. In the United States, Midway entered the cultural lexicon not as a parade-worthy celebration, but as a symbol of grit, a story where intelligence, courage, and timing had defied the odds. Books were written, films produced. Yet the most enduring legacy didn't come from Hollywood. It came from the quiet humility of those who had lived it. Men like Wade McCluskey, the dive bomber pilot whose last-minute decision to change course led his squadron to the Japanese carriers. Or Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade, who kept Yorktown's air operations going even as bombs rained down. These weren't superheroes, they were professionals, doing their jobs under unimaginable pressure. Japan, too, began to honor the battle with new eyes. Once seen through a lens of shame and loss, Midway was increasingly understood as a turning point, where the cost of overconfidence became tragically clear. Young officers studied the missteps, the delay in rearming, the confusion on the decks, the failure to anticipate a counter-strike. More importantly, they studied the humanity within the defeat. Men like Rear Admiral Yamamoto, who refused evacuation and chose to go down with Hiryu. His death, once cloaked in nationalism, now read as a symbol of integrity and conviction. Flawed, perhaps, but deeply human. Across both nations, memorials quietly emerged. A plaque here, a preserved aircraft there. In museums, the battle was represented not by boasts or flags, but by worn pilot gear, black and white photographs, and letters never sent. A generation reaching out from the past, asking not to be forgotten. And they weren't. Upon the passing of the last known participant from a significant historical event, flags were lowered in tribute. At a commemorative site, people stood in respectful silence. The ceremony was brief and respectful, a quiet honor, just as those individuals might have wished. And so the memory of that event endures, not just as a pivotal chapter in our shared story, but as a reflection of the human spirit. It tells a story of careful planning and quick thinking, of overcoming challenges and finding new paths forward. It highlights important lessons learned through experience. The story continues to be a source of discussion and learning, but one truth remains clear: during a few pivotal days, the course of events took a decisive turn. This was not by chance, but by the choices made by dedicated individuals who rose to meet the moment. And in their rise, they carried the world with them. To be continued. June 1942 was more than just a date in history. It was a hinge on which the fate of nations swung. The Battle of Midway, compressed into 4 intense days, became a testament to the fragility of power and the resilience of those who bear the burden of war. For the Japanese Empire, it marked the beginning of retreat. The illusion of unchecked dominance shattered under the weight of flawed assumptions, overconfidence, and a single strike of fate. For the United States, it was a hard-earned moment of affirmation. That courage, preparation, and determination could overcome even the fiercest of enemies. But Midway was never simply a victory or defeat. It was a reckoning. Thousands of lives ended in those remote waters. Fathers, sons, brothers, many of them never found. Their voices silenced, their stories cut short. And while nations moved on, drafting new strategies and launching new campaigns, the cost of Midway lingered in the hearts of families across both shores of the Pacific. In that cost lies the true lesson of Midway. War, for all its strategies and grand speeches, is ultimately paid in human lives. Brilliant minds can plan operations, powerful machines can be built, but when orders are given, it is the young who carry them out, and who often pay the highest price. The carriers that now rest at the ocean floor are not just wrecks, they are reminders. That pride must be tempered by wisdom, that leadership must listen, adapt, and consider the lives it commands. And that history is not written only by victors, but by those who remember. Today the Pacific is peaceful, the skies over Midway are quiet. But beneath those calm waves lie the remnants of a battle that forever altered the course of World War II, and the course of humanity's understanding of war itself. So let us not just remember the strategy or the headlines, let us remember the men, the choices, the silence that followed, because history isn't just about what happened, it's about what we carry forward. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Share your thoughts in the comments, maybe a story passed down through your family, or what this chapter in history means to you. We remember Midway not to glorify war, but but to understand its cost and to honor those who paid it.